hobbits are just rustic English people, made small in size because it reflects the general small reach of their imagination, but it's not the small reach of their courage or latent power.
I think the hobbits are not only specifically English, but Tolkien would have said straight away that they're specifically West Midlanders, that they remind him of the society of his youth, and they come actually from Warwickshire, Worcestershire, possibly Oxfordshire, Herefordshire, but he really means a very close area. And in many ways they represent, as it were, traditional English feelings. One of the things, for instance, which Sam Gamgee says at one point, which is quite anachronistic in The Lord of the Rings, he says to Gollum, who is complaining about the food as usual, he says, look, if we ever get home, Gollum, I'll cook you some nice fish and chips. Well, potatoes actually shouldn't exist in Middle-earth because they are, a late introduction to this world. Nevertheless, fish and chips is the traditional English diet, and that naturally then is what the hobbits offer. That's their main idea of a delicacy. They're also, I think, in a sense, a voice from the past, not the remote past, the rather recent past. But the hobbits have the attitude, perhaps, of my grandfather's time. They are firmly attached to comfort, to 6 square meals a day if they can get them. They haven't heard about dieting or slimming or anything like that. You would never get a hobbit jogging, I think, under any circumstances. Nevertheless, they have virtues of their own. And they are, as Tolkien says, surprisingly able to endure rough handling. There is a kind of toughness in the fibre which they have.
Yet Tolkien himself was equivocal about both them and the book.
On the 14th of December 1937, 2 months after The Hobbit had been published, and I think about 2 days before he began the Lord of the Rings, he said to a friend of his, he wrote to a friend of his, I don't much approve of The Hobbit myself, preferring my own mythology, which is just touched on, with its consistent nomenclature. Elrond, Gondolin have escaped out of it, and organized history. I prefer that to this rabble of Eddaic-named dwarves out of the Volospar, newfangled hobbits and golems invented in an idle hour, and Anglo-Saxon runes.
Tolkien's own mythology had begun many years earlier in his first and perhaps most important creative work, which would not be published until after his death.
The Silmarillion was the primary, central work of my father's secondary world. One of the chief things that people know about it, I think, is that it was unfinished. But I think this is, in a way, misleading. The real point is that there were several Silmarillions. When he was a very young man, during the First World War, and in the years immediately following, he wrote a work called The Book of Lost Tales, which the little notebooks that he used still exist, little penny notebooks, and some parts of it, he recorded, were written in the trenches under shell fire. And this was the first Silmarillion, although he didn't then call it that. It's quite unlike his later manner of writing, when he adopted a much more remote, exalted even manner for his mythology. It's more immediate. It's even funny. It's written in an extraordinarily flowery, consciously archaic manner, which I think is very attractive. But there already, often in very early undeveloped forms, are the great stories, the great legends, which were an inspiration to him throughout his life. Above all, the Lay of Beren and Luthien, and the tragedy of Turin Turamba. Another Silmarillion was already in existence by about 1930. And that is very different. It's, as I say, it's in a more remote style, and it's more chronicle-like. But the important thing is that was finished. The Book of Lost Tales, you could say, was finished. The 1930 Silmarillion was finished. It's complete. A completely enclosed myth, not presupposing any later ages. And at that stage, The Hobbit had no connection with it. In fact, he said in a letter that he wrote in 1964, he said, by the time The Hobbit appeared in 1937, the Silmarillion was in coherent form. The Hobbit was not intended to have anything to do with it. I had the habit, while my children were still young, of inventing and telling orally, sometimes of writing down, children's stories in inverted commas, for their private amusement. The Hobbit was intended to be one of them. It had no necessary connection with the mythology, by which he means the Silmarillion, but naturally became attracted towards this dominant construction in my mind, causing the tale to become larger and more heroic as it proceeded. Even so, it could really stand quite apart. And so you see, the famous names of Middle-earth, such as the Misty Mountains, Mirkwood, the great river of Wilderland, they began with The Hobbit and had no necessary association at all with the mythology as it existed at that time. The Lord of the Rings began as the sequel to The Hobbit. But this dominant construction in my mind, as he said, attracted everything into it. Attracted The Hobbit, and still more, of course, attracted The Lord of the Rings. So The Lord of the Rings becomes, in the most complex fashion, both the sequel to The Hobbit and heavily involved with the Silmarillion.
The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's heroic romance, as he called it, with its vast imagined world, was begun in 1937. But it took him 12 years to write. At the same time, he continued with his academic work as Professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, which was so closely related to his creative writing.
That they were intertwined with each other. What I call the content as opposed to the practice of his academic work is one of the primary ingredients in the secondary world of many kinds. Anglo-Saxon above all. And of course the philology. The philology of the primary world relates very closely to the languages of the secondary world. Sindarin and Quenya, the languages, the Elvish languages of Middle-earth. They're totally different in the sense in which he meant to use the word fantasy. They are the languages of the fantasy. But they're very hard. They're hard-bitten. They have their own severe phonetics, their severe grammatical history. It shows, I think, is important, is it shows what the word fantasy means. There's nothing crazy or absurd in the idea. His fantasy philology is just as strict as the philology of the Germanic languages that he practiced that he expounded as a professor. So I think that his academic, the content of his academic life, as I say, intertwined and was productive, very in his sub-creative work.
It seems to me that he poured everything he knew about early literature into the fiction, and that one of the great strengths of the fiction has been this sense of an enormous weight of knowledge and accumulated experience and accumulated thought which has been put into it and which cannot be counterfeited, which cannot be faked.
In terms of actual content, of course, an important element in The Lord of the Rings, which plays no part in The Hobbit, or in the Silmarillion, but plays a very important part in The Lord of the Rings, is the kingdom of Rohan, which is modelled on, in a sense, transformed. It's not supposed to be historical because it's in the secondary world, but the inspiration for Rohan derives very evidently from Anglo-Saxon England. And the philology does not derive from any direct imitation of real languages in the world. Not at all. But of because it does derive from his mastery of the history of actual languages. That is to say, his knowledge of the history of English, German, so forth, other Germanic languages. He used this kind of knowledge, his knowledge of phonetics, of phonetic history, to devise his own languages. That is what gives them their extraordinary credibility, because he composed them historically. He started from ancient forms, and just as with a real language, within the history of Middle Earth, he devised the changes of pronunciation that overtook them, just as they do in real languages. And therefore, if he wanted a new word within one of these languages, he didn't simply select a few syllables that attracted him. He worked out what that word would actually be. And he works out the sound changes that will, fictionally, will have passed over them in the course of time, as they do in all languages. And this is what gives to these languages their extraordinary, one of the most powerful things in his works, even for those who have no understanding of the nature of the philology, this extraordinary sense that they cohere, they are real, they have the trademark of being a totally individual speech. Just as even if you don't know French, you can say that's French or that's Swedish, because they have the characteristic note and quality, and his languages do that.
And were the languages Tolkien created comprehensive?
They're not entirely comprehensive because they don't have a big enough vocabulary. On the other hand, I think what you do when you're creating languages is to work out the grammar first, and then, in Tolkien's case, you work out the main verbal roots, and then you play around with the verbal roots. And at the end of it, you have the grammar and the beginnings of a dictionary. But you also have the potential for creating the rest of the dictionary. But you don't have to create the whole of the dictionary. You only use the words you happen to need at that particular moment.
I first began seriously to invent language about when I was 13 or 14. I've never stopped, really. Languages have a flavor to me, which I never understand people saying, for instance, it was awfully dry and dull, because a new language to me is just like taking a new wine or a new sweetmeat or something.
As the creator or sub-creator of these languages, he could take great delight in them because he could make the sounds that were developed by the phonetic changes attractive to his own ear. So that he could say that Quenya was the language as he really deeply desired, whereas none of the languages of the world really came quite there. He loved Anglo-Saxon, but he didn't like it as much. He loved Finnish, which was an important influence on Quenya. But Quenya was the language of his heart. It was the language that he wanted.
What I'm doing now is to try and write in Elvish, because obviously my writing is very inferior to the Elves. Their standard greeting when meeting, a star shines upon our meeting. Lord, I made a mistake, didn't I? And that stands for Ellen, Sila, Lumen, Aumenti Elbow. It's a rather beautiful language, isn't it? Ar elderet Lilconiel, Sigivren Penamiriel, o Menel Aglar Elena, Nahaire Palandiriel, o Galasremin Enora, Panuilos, Lelinaton, Nevaya, Si Nevayaron.
During the long years in which he worked on the languages and the legends, the stories themselves seemed to evolve, as if under other influence than that of their creator.
In the case, for instance, particularly of the Silmarillion, what is so fascinating is because it lasted so long,
And because he wrote so many versions, you can follow the changes in great detail when you've got the papers in the right order. And the movements of the legends, moving from one text to another very gradually, mean that after a passage of years in my father's life, you have a movement in the legends similar to the actual movements in the legends of actual peoples. So you see, in one particular case I can think of, a great king in the earlier stages of the mythology, Horodreth of Nargothrond. He slowly, as the years pass, becomes diminished and is ultimately rejected completely from the dynasty, the kingly dynasty he belonged to. And the reason for this was that another of my father's legends slowly made contact with the first one, and the internal dynamics of the legends forced this king into a inferior, and therefore he becomes cowardly, weak, and in a sense disappears through the sheer internal energy or dynamics of the movements of the legends.
Throughout his life, J.R.R. Tolkien enjoyed discussing literary subjects with his friends and colleagues. He belonged to many literary clubs, both official and unofficial, where lively debates took place. In Oxford for many years, he was a central figure in a group called the Inklings. They met every week in a pub called the Eagle and Child.
It's only strangers who call it the Eagle and Child. It's really the Bird and Baby. And in the Bird and Baby, the Inklings, who were a group of like-minded dons and near-dons, used to meet from 1939 right through the war. They came every Tuesday lunchtime. They sat in this room, and they were, in fact, a club, a male club. And they met also in evenings in C.S. Lewis's rooms in Magdalen. Very few outside his generation came to them. I was lodging during some of this period just up the road. I never knew they were happening, these meetings of the Inklings. But it was a very important thing, and it's nice to be still in this pub, and where you can imagine them sitting around, not in great comfort, and during the war, not with even very much beer, but talking literary talk, and working in complete isolation from the rest of the literary establishment.
During the evening meetings in Lewis's rooms, the Inklings read parts of their books to each other. The Lord of the Rings was read chapter by chapter.
That sound the bent shape of the king sprang suddenly erect, tall and proud he seemed again, and rising in his stirrups he cried in a loud voice more clear than any there had ever heard a mortal man achieve before. Arise, arise, riders of Theoden! Fell leads awake fire and slaughter. Spear shall be shaken, shield is splintered, sword day, red day, ere the sun rises. Ride now, ride to Gondor!
The Inklings had a small nucleus of regular members, with others attending on an occasional basis. But at the center of the group was Tolkien's great friend, C.S. Lewis.
The profound attachment and imaginative intimacy between him and Lewis was, I think, in some ways the real core of it. Certainly, it was of profound importance to my father and to that relationship. Indeed, to both of them. The fact that they drifted apart in their later on, I think myself was sad. But I think I would say it was no more than a drifting apart. I don't think myself that it really requires to be studied in depth. I think what I should concentrate on was the extraordinary support of mind, of taste that they offered each other.
I think he felt that he owed a very great deal to Lewis in his encouragement of him as a writer. And I think he did say, and certainly conveyed this, that but for Lewis's encouragement when things were difficult, he might never have got The Lord of the Rings complete. So I think he felt an enormous debt to him there, and they mutually gave each other great encouragement over their writings. I think that it was the most tremendous grief and blow when Lewis died, even though in the years preceding Lewis's death, following Lewis's marriage, and also after his move to Cambridge, they'd not met regularly and they'd seen very little of each other, and there was a lessening of the bond, a loosening of the bonds, and a loss of what my father would call the communion between them. But nonetheless, I think the memory was always there, and the affection remained. In a letter he wrote to me, which is in response to a letter I wrote to him of sympathy after Lewis's death, he said that he had the normal feelings of a man of his age who feels he's losing his leaves one by one, but that Lewis's death felt like an axe being taken to the roots, which I think expresses far more than anything else what he must have felt.
With Lewis's encouragement, Tolkien persevered with the enormous task of completing The Lord of the Rings. It is often said that the writings of any major author must, to some extent, be autobiographical. How true was this in Tolkien's case, both specifically in The Lord of the Rings and generally in his other works?
I have a passage taken from my father's story, Leaf by Nigel, which is probably the most obviously autobiographical of anything he wrote, I think. And Mr. Nigel is a painter who can never get his big work finished, which is the painting of a tree. And finally he comes to die, which is what is called in the story going on a journey. And he finds himself eventually in another country. Nigel pushed open the gate, jumped on the bicycle, and went bowling downhill in the spring sunshine. Before long, he found the path on which he had started had disappeared, and the bicycle was rolling along over a marvellous turf. It was green and close, and yet he could see every blade distinctly. He seemed to remember having seen or dreamed of that sweep of grass, somewhere or other. The curves of the land were familiar somehow. Yes, the ground was becoming level, as it should, but now, of course, it was beginning to rise again. A great green shadow came between him and the sun. Nigel looked up and fell off his bicycle. Before him stood the tree, his tree, finished. If you could say that of a tree, it was alive, its leaves opening, its branches growing and bending in the wind, that Nigel had so often felt or guessed, and had so often failed to catch. He gazed at the tree, and slowly he lifted his arms and opened them wide. It's a gift, he said. He was referring to his art, and also to the result. But he was using the word quite literally. And that passage, I think, illustrates very profoundly my father's belief in the source of his own inspiration.
One of the things where I feel rather sympathetic to Tolkien is that he was a very private person. He didn't expect, as it were, to have biographical criticism perpetrated on him, and I don't think he'd have liked it if it had happened. Having said that, nobody can avoid putting their personal life into their fiction. I mean, what else have you got to put into it other than, in his case, the learning? So I'm sure that in many respects, like, for instance, his war service, his experience with the war, and also the terrible experience of having been in the war to end all wars and then seeing his sons go off to fight the next war to end all wars, all that, I think, is very much part of his fiction. And one way of looking at The Lord of the Rings, I think, is to see it as a post-war book, except, of course, it was written during the Second World War. But all that, I think, affects it powerfully.
He was a very jovial man and loved good company, good wine, good conversation. But it frequently came through that he had an underlying melancholy. I think he believed very deeply in the mythical, historical framework that the world is running down from a golden age and has gone fairly far. And that, of course, is also the framework of his whole creative work, now that we have so much more than just The Lord of the Rings. And his sorrow at the destruction of the English countryside, this came out again and again and again, and that is really encapsulated in what the heroes of The Lord of the Rings found when they went back to the Shire. And the sense of evil actually comes across to me more powerfully in that scene when they come back to the Shire and see that the meanness of the destruction, this is more powerful to me than all the evocation of the grand and cosmic evils of Mordor itself. Because I think the other was storytelling, but this was what he had felt.
It was one of the saddest hours in their lives. The great chimney rose up before them, and as they drew near the old village across the water, through rows of new mean houses along each side of the road, they saw the new mill in all its frowning and dirty ugliness, a great brick building straddling the stream, which it fouled with a steaming and stinking outflow. All along the Bywater Road, every tree had been felled. As they crossed the bridge and looked up the hill, they gasped. Even Sam's vision in the mirror had not prepared him for what they saw. The old grange on the west side had been knocked down, and its place taken by rows of tarred sheds. All the chestnuts were gone. The banks and hedgerows were broken. Great wagons were standing in disorder in a field beaten bare of grass. Bagshot Row was a yawning sand and gravel quarry. Bag End up beyond could not be seen for a clutter of large huts. "They've cut it down," cried Sam. "They've cut down the party tree." He pointed to where the tree had stood, under which Bilbo had made his farewell speech. It was lying lopped and dead in the field. As if this was the last straw, Sam burst into tears.
Tolkien, I think, had a melancholic streak. Perhaps that's putting it too far. I would put it this way, that when he was 22, he had many friends. When he was 26, they were nearly all dead. Obviously, an experience like this does affect anybody, and from a very early period, Tolkien obviously continues to think about death. And part of his mythology is to construct a race of creatures who are deathless and who wish to escape from deathlessness in the way that human beings wish to escape from death. But the center of all that is the thought of death. The strange thing, perhaps, is that everybody thinks like this sooner or later or at some time, but Tolkien was thinking about that very early on, and it was a thought which never left him. But I think the reason there is actually quite clearly biographical. It's caused by the experience of the First World War and by seeing his whole generation of age mates at school just wiped out, apart from himself.
If you really come down to any large story that interests people, can hold them attention for a considerable time, or make the stories practically